Okay. Frances Nicholas, who lived in Auburn 400 years ago, a way of death. There will be a bit about her life. Frances Reeve was the daughter of John and Dorothy Reeve and baptized in London in 1626. John Reeve was an apothecary and a citizen in the city of London. So he'd made his way up in the world. He was a member of the Worshipful Company of Apothecaries. His shop would have probably looked something like this, and he would have probably dressed something like this. And as you can see, some of his sales are at the bottom. Purgatives, emetics, opium, quinine, camphor, saltpeter, mercury. Doesn't look too enticing. And he would have made up his own pills and potions, as you can see from the giant pestle and mortar on the left, the small one on the right, and the still on the floor. The still is sitting on top of the little furnace, if you can see the little brick built tower with the fire inside at the front. John died before 1648, when Frances was married in Chelsea to Oliver Nicholas of Auburn. We know this because they were married by license from the Bishop of London. He was a gent of Auburn, 26, and Frances of St. Clement Danes was 22, and she married with the consent of her mother, Dorothy Reeve. So that tells us that there was no father to give permission. Oliver Nicholas was the son of Edward Nicholas of All Cannings and Dorothy Walrand of Auburn. The All Cannings family of Nicholases were the senior branch of the family. The Nicholases in Auburn were one of the cadet branches, a younger son and younger son. Families didn't usually move outside their own social class, such as the Warrens, Martins, Nicholases, St. Johns, and the Goddards. They all mixed and intermarried. Very rarely for love. It was a business match so that you could get your hands on more land holdings, more money. They also had similar professions, and they were very often freemen of the City of London, which opened lots of doors. As you can see, they had the freedom to do lots. Is there any way? Oh, I can. There were 3 ways of becoming a freeman of the City of London: patrimony. Your father, actually there were some mothers. Father was a liveryman, so he could pass that on to a son. Redemption by paying what is known as a fine. You could buy your way in, or you could get it by servitude. You served an apprenticeship in London. Many boys, and I do mean many boys from Auburn, served an apprenticeship in the City of London. They in time acted as a master to a new apprentice, often from their old hometown or village. I've just picked out 5 from the local families. The Martin family of Upham. The son was apprenticed to a grocer. Wardren, father gentleman, was also apprenticed as a grocer. Ditto, Roger Nicholas, son of Edward, a gentleman, was also apprenticed to a grocer. Edward Nicholas was apprenticed to a fishmonger. And Richard Martin, also of Upham, was apprenticed to a vintner. Now, Even though they're apprenticed to grocers, fishmongers, and all sorts of lowly sounding trades, once they'd served their 7 years apprenticeship, they then became a citizen of the City of London, which opened lots of doors. Okay, we're back with Oliver Nicholas. Was the son of Edward Nicholas of All Cannings and Dorothy Warren of Albourne. They just were married together. It was more or less a business arrangement. Oliver and Frances had 5 children: Oliver, Dorothy, Frances, who died fairly young, St. John, and Edward. They were all baptized in Albourne Church. Dorothy Reeve, mother of Francis Nicholas, died in 1678. She was the one who was the apothecary's daughter. And she's buried in Albourne Church. Oliver Nicholas died in 1683, and his wife Frances, who's the main subject of the talk, is 1697, and they're all buried in the church. And this is where they lived, often called the parsonage, courthouse, vicarage, you name it. There's an overhead view from the church tower, which is an old postcard, and in the lower one, you can just see end on where it's called the vicarage there, I think it is. Right close to the church. So they were seen to be part and parcel of the established church. Okay. There were lots of funeral customs, death customs. In the early 17th century, the body of a noblewoman was laid out and waiting for a funeral here. And that would have probably been the same thing for Francis Nicholas up at the parsonage. When I recorded all of the memorial inscriptions back in the 1980s for the church and churchyard, I didn't see this one. It must have been hidden under a carpet or behind something. It's a brass plaque, obviously. Now, unfortunately, it has been transferred to a notice next to it, which is not quite as it should be. Dorothea is the Latin for Dorothy. Somebody has taken the long S's and assumed they were the F's and has put a crossbar on them. And the Dorothea Reeve, Vidua Mater, Francisi, it should be an AE on the end. Nicholas Uxoris Oliveri, Nicholas Armigeri, obiit, tertio die. There should be another I on the end of June. Anno Dom, 1676. Aetatis is missing the second E because the A and the E are elided, same as the A and E on the end of Francis. And for some reason, we've got Odo Jeffsimo. It's OCT OGESS. It's not an F. So that's 80 non-09. It's a bit of a shame, but the translation is fine. This is Dorothea's will. Dorothy's will. And this is a translation, or transcription, I should say. But the words that I've highlighted tells us that she's leaving to Edward, her youngest son, all my lands in Essex by the names of Rushley Marsh. Now, I have searched maps for Rushley Marsh in Essex, and the nearest I can come to is Rushy Mead, which is somewhere near Colchester. which tells us that Dorothy came from a well-off family. The family had estates, and she obviously still owned them because she's leaving them in her will. Now, sometimes you can find bits of information in unexpected places. Church wardens' presentments. The church wardens, the two of them, had to make annual presentments to the dean or the bishop, depending which part of the diocese you lived in. And the church wardens were expected to report on the fabric of the church, the conduct of the minister, the morals and religious inclinations of the inhabitants. Now, we know they did because I have looked at the presentments for the late 1600s, and there were an enormous number of nonconformists that were being reported because they shouldn't have been in Auburn. However, the one we're interested in is the presentment of 1695. Item, we present the church leads on the fourth side of the church out of repair. That is the lead sheeting on whatever the fourth side was that he was talking about. We present the pavement of the church near the porch door out of repair, and the church and the porch door. Item, we present Mrs. Nicholas, occupier of the parsonage, for keeping 2 seats for her servant and others in the body of the church and paying nothing towards the repair of the church. In those days, there weren't pews for everybody. There may have been some in our church. You rented a pew or a seat. So obviously she was having her seats, but she wasn't paying anything towards the upkeep or repair of the church. Item, we present John Pierce, John Collins, Thomas Jones, William Gilbert and Widow Gilbert do rent about £500 per annum of Richard Jones Esquire. Now, I think that is referring to they rent land from him. So they've got enough money to rent land. And they are denied to sit in those vacant seats which the parsonage doth claim in the body of the church and in any other seats, and yet do pay their taxes to the repairs of the church. So these people who rent land, they are paying the church dues, but Mrs. Nicholas isn't. And they're presenting her because she's doing something wrong. She should be paying. You find lots of information in people's wills, where to be buried. Thomas Hobbes, these are all Auburn wills. Thomas Hobbes, my body to be buried in the churchyard of Auburn. Henry Reeve, and my body to be buried in the parish church of Auburn. Roger Waldron, to be buried in the chancel of the parish church of Auburn. John Bennett, to be buried by the chancel end of the churchyard of Auburn. They all want to be near the chancel end. Humphrey Simpson, to be buried in Auburn Church under the place where I usually sit. So I shall be keeping my eyes on you from the other side of the grave. John Adey, who is one of my favourite people in Auburn, he's wonderful. He puts, to be decently buried in the parish churchyard of Auburn and laid as near where my father and mother, brothers and sisters and children were laying as conveniently may be. And I do advise my dear wife not to be at any great charge at my funeral. This is from the 1783 Glebe Terrier. It's nothing to do with yappy little dogs. If you look at the bottom, it's a document. And the part that we're interested in is the part what's happening in the church, what there is. There's a large fire engine and pipes. There's a smaller one, 2 fire hooks, so far all about fire fighting, a ladder, 2 forms, grave boards, 12 old buckets in the room over the porch. Now, the bit we're interested in is the grave boards. Grave boards. Grave boards as you can read. They died out after about 1800. So they didn't mark the head and the foot, they marked along the grave. These are about the only ones remaining in the country. These were taken in churches in Hertfordshire. More things from the wills. Roger Waldron. Item, I give unto the poor people of Auburn aforesaid 40 shillings. I'll just interrupt there. A pound in those days is worth about £140 in today's. The buying power of a pound then is about £140 now. I give them 40 shillings to be distributed amongst them at my funeral or shortly thereafter. John Adey. And I do advise my dear wife not to be at any great charge at my funeral. And as for that small estate, as the Lord in mercy hath lent me, my will is that it shall be disposed of as hereafter mentioned. Alexander Wellman, he was a glove maker in Auburn. Also, I give unto the said William Gwynn, because he'd already given something to William, £8 to be laid out on my funeral. And William Gwynn was the husband of his niece, Sarah. Thomas Wells. This is from a Ramsbury will, but there was very often a crossover between the local villages. And my will is that my executors in trust shall immediately after my decease purchase 6 yards of black broadcloth at no less a price than 17 shillings. So we're getting on for over £100 worth of material, shillings a yard, and that the said black cloth be put over my coffin when I am carried to be buried, and that the said black cloth forever shall be for the use of the poor of the said parish of Ramsbury to put over their coffins when they are going to be buried. Jacob Mell of Ramsbury. I'll just go on one. No, it's not coming. The Mells and the Adamses were intermarried. So we've got Edney Adams in Ramsbury, and they married into the Mell family at Auburn, and they married into the Ramsbury Mells. And he says, my body to be buried on the north side of the church towards the chancel, not far from the north door, and then to have a broad stone laid on my grave. I desire only a decent burial. When we used to go to church from Preston, we used to go in the north door. So we would have passed his grave. Item, I give to Mr. Henry Dent of Ramsbury £5. Now, Mr. Henry Dent was a very well-known nonconformist preacher, and he used to go and preach to all his followers in the morning, and then he went and sat in the church in the afternoon for the service, and I can't remember the vicar's name. So he had a foot in both sides, just to be sure. Item, I give and bequeath to the poor of Ramsbury £6, that is to say, the poor labouring men and poor labouring widows to be distributed by the hand or according to the order of my executor hereafter named. Item, for my funeral expenses, I allow £20. £20 is a lot of money. Item, I give to the minister that shall preach my funeral sermon upon 2 Corinthians verses 3 to 11, £1. That's the only time I've come across that. This is Edney Adams, son of George Adams, and was born in 1670, and he married Sarah Mell, who was the daughter of Gustavus Mell, who was a citizen and draper of the City of London. And at the bottom, you'll see their son was a citizen, draper, and grocer of the City of London. It helped you get on in the world. I don't think we need to go into the sermon. What did the mourners wear? Chief mourners at a high-ranking funeral would have normally worn black, but ordinarily people would have worn what was likely to be their only set of clothes, their everyday clothing. They wore hat bands, long, narrow lengths of black crepe, which were tied around the crown of their hat, so the long ends hung down the back. Gloves of varying qualities, depending on the wealth of the family. Kid or chamois leather were usually worn by the principal mourners. Favours, these were probably a combination of rosemary fronds and silkwood ribbons. It was something to sniff and take away the smell of everything else. This is what a funeral procession might well have looked like. You can see the crepe ribbons hanging down the back of the men's black hats, and the pall over the coffin, and it's also going over the pallbearers. I don't know if there's one in Auburn Church. There used to be, because I can remember seeing it. I don't know. The top one is where you had men carrying the coffin on top of that. The one on the right is a two-wheeled, well, it's like a wheelbarrow, and it had a leg at the front, which was lower down so that the coffin didn't slide off when you stop. And the bottom one on the left is, is for pulling, men pulling it. And you've all seen pictures of horse-drawn biers. Surprisingly, Francis Nicholas did not leave a will, which was surprising. However, a very careful inventory had to be made of all her goods and chattels so that her estate could be settled properly. And this is what it looks like. That's shrunk, and the original is bigger than that. A true and perfect inventory of all the goods, household stuff, ready money, plate, corn, hay, and chattels whatsoever that Mistress Francis Nicholas died possessed of. This is the top half, which you can see a bit more clearly. And here I've transcribed it. Her wearing apparel, it was only valued at £10. I would have thought somebody of her stature and standing would have had more clothing than that. Well, I suppose if you times that by £140, it's a fair bit. She had only £4 10 shillings ready money, plate, 3 silver spoons, 3 brass spoons, 3 salt cellars, a silver cup with 2 handles and 3 forks. Household linen as sheets and table linen. Some inventories go into great detail. It's a shame this doesn't give you a bit more information, because it just says the furniture of the great parlour, and it was only worth £3. Above stairs, 6 table boards, but no frames for them to sit on. Above stairs, 10 chairs. In the chamber over the hall. Now, we don't know which would be her bedroom. Bolster and pillow, 4 blankets, curtains, valance and hangings. Furniture of the garret. I'm presuming that's where the servants would have slept. In the chamber over the kitchen. Now, I would have chosen that one because presumably it would have been a bit warmer. A bed bolster, 5 pillows, 1 quilt, 2 blankets, 1 bedstead, curtains and valance, 2 pair of fire shovels and tongs, chest of drawers and window curtains. So she had a fire in there. This would have probably been something like her bed, and the curtains and valances would have been attached to that. So it was in effect a little room inside her chamber. It would have kept out all the drafts. Here's the bottom half of her inventory. And then it goes on to some of the stuff from her farm or rented land. The wheat rick, the hay rick. The wheat rick is worth a lot. It even gives the value of the fields that have already been sown. This is just to show that there's a rick, the far left, there's a rick on Staddlestones. It would have been a frame that you built the rick on. And if you look at the barn that's just behind it, you can see a ladder along the side of it. That would have been a thatching ladder so that you could reach up to the top of the ricks and the top of the stable or whatever that was. And the barn at the very back has the double doors opening, and there would have been the similar double doors at the back, so that in the winter when there was not much work on, the ricks would have been taken down and the corn taken inside the barn, and it would have been winnowed and fanned. And with the doors open right through, the chaff would have been hopefully blown away, and they could just bag up the wheat. Buildings on top of Staddlestones. Now this is the account, and it's the original is quite large. This is the top. It's a true and perfect account of Nicholas Esquire, the son and administrator. The charge is what is coming in. The discharge is what's going out. And this is what he had to settle. We can tell by this that poor old Francis had been in bed ill for a long time. The coffin, the use of a pall, so perhaps Albourne Church had a similar pall that could be used by anybody, like the Ramsbury one had got. The embalmer, she was embalmed. Is everybody okay with what embalming meant? All of the body fluids were drained out and they were replaced by other liquids. But it cost £9 to be embalmed. The sexton was paid that, so he would have been the one in charge of organising what went where in the church and also opening up the floor for the coffin to be lowered into. Gould the mason. Now we assume he would have been engraving the next item. Christopher Ewing was paid £3.17 for the gravestone, and presumably Gould chipped away at the engraving on it. This is the one that's an eye-opener. Mr. Forster for wine at the funeral, £10. What were they doing? Yeah, I mean, either they drank a lot each or they had all the village in to share, which I don't think they did. That's an awful lot of wine. This is the next section of the discharge. She had an apothecary attending her, £2.11 They bought scarves and hat bands to give out to the mourners, £7, a lot of money, but not nearly as much as they paid to Alexander, it's actually Wellman, for funeral gloves, £14. William Benger, I don't know who he is, for bays. Now I'm assuming it's the bay horses that would have drawn something, because I don't know any other bays. A bay horse is, as you can see, it's predominantly brown, various shades of brown, but they have the mane, the forelock, the tail, and around the hooves were always black. They were draft horses. Paid James Leach for escutcheons. Escutcheons are, as we all know, it's the shield in a coat of arms. They're not always this shape. There's about 8-10 different shaped shields. That's an awful lot of money, £13. Edward Hinton, the grocer, only 17 shillings. John Salt, the butcher, 14 shillings and 5 guineas. I'm not quite sure Collins upon the Burial Act was, and paid to the minister for burial duties for his services. There's the bay horse, the escutcheon. This is the next section of the discharge. William Jackson was the vicar at the time, and she'd obviously promised him some money. Anne Bartlett got almost £13 for wages that she was owed. It's a lot of money. Nicholas Adams, gardener, so she had a gardener. She had people who came in and looked after her. Tricky one, Anne Bartlett, what she paid for the window. We'll never know whether somebody accidentally broke a window. They had a special window put in. Thomas Brind, due to him, some bill she hadn't settled. William Hartley, the joiner, was owed money. So was Miss William Sayer of Lambourne. He provided boards. We can only guess why. Samuel Fowler, the draper, he perhaps provided some of these hat bands and gloves, whatever. Mr. Darnell for interest money due in 1696. Don't know. Perhaps she borrowed money and had to pay interest. £25, that's a lot. John Cumner was owed money. So was Martha Barnes. Barnes is back then. Widow of William Barnes. And the last part of the discharge account. John Lydiard, a debt. Daniel Sparble for ironwork to the gates. We don't really know. Paid to the Church of Winton, that's the Cathedral Church of Winchester. They owned a lot of land around here, so that she was renting land from the cathedral. And she owed William Jackson £1. And then William Jackson also procured the commission and letters of administration with bonds and stamps and inventory. All this paperwork had to be paid for. He had to ride to Salisbury to get all these things. Paid for the fees of double drawing and passing the account engrossing and registering the same. So he has to do quite a lot of work. And that all cost £200 plus. This might have been something like Francis's coffin. Her coffin is buried under the church floor, where it might have been damp. So it might have been held up out of the damp by, looks like some rickety tower of stones. This is a hatchment. This is the one that's displayed in Albourne Church, and it is nothing to do with the Nicholas family. There's only the one in the church. The escutcheon, as you can see, is that shield in the middle, the white with the 3 sheaves of corn and the chevron. What used to happen, the well-to-do families, they would have at least one, possibly half a dozen or more of these hatchments painted. And it may be that the discharge is referring to, this is what they're referring to when he says the escutcheons cost so much. And they would have been displayed on the gate of the house where the deceased lived. And sometimes they were down the road or the path that led from the house to the church. No idea whose hatchment this is. Does anybody know?
It's Colonel Sir Thomas Hatton.
Ah, well,
which is interesting because you've got one of the witnesses to her.
yes, because Thomas had married one of the daughters and she'd already died. It was Frances Hatton. It was Frances Hatton married Francis Nicholas, and she'd already died. Ah.
There's another interesting thing with this, and I've never worked this out. You know the Phillips monumental inscriptions, which was 1820. It has the inscription for Colonel Sir Oliver Nicholas's gravestone, who was the son.
Yes.
But for some reason, they seem to have used the same stone for Colonel Thomas Hatton.
Oh, right.
So
yes, because he was the Lieutenant Governor of Portsmouth, the one who.
No, that was the father. That was Oliver Nicholas Senior, wasn't it?
I thought it. Okay.
There were 2 Oliver Nicholases. The senior was the Portsmouth guy, and the son was the MP.
Yeah. Okay, so this is indirectly, obviously, to do with the Nicholas family, but there's the coffin waiting to be buried underground, or it is being buried underground. This is the hatchment. This is Francis Nicholas's ledger stone, and it's in the west door, inside the west door of the church. It has her coat of arms at the top and the details of the family. Unfortunately, when I took the photograph, it wasn't light enough and you couldn't see it. So I had to get some water from the sink there and put it all over so that the water went into the little tiny indentations and it picked it up a little bit. And I had hoped to get over and do it again with some more lights and a bit more water, but I didn't. Death is the wish of some, the relief of many, and the end of all. Lucius Ananias Seneca, who was a Roman author. And that is the end.